The back half of the 20th century is often referred to as the nuclear age. By splitting the atom, sure, man learned a new way to power steam engines, but more importantly, they had a weapon that could level a city in a matter of seconds. These atom bombs revolutionized society around the globe. Within a decade of their inception, citizens were building fallout shelters in their backyards, and children were learning to hide under their desks in case of a nuclear blast. These devices had the ability to reshape the landscape of humanity, change the course of human history. Which is why we treated them with complete nonchalance, which led to several high-profile mistakes that easily could have killed millions of people. This is No One Is Competent, a show dedicated to exposing the stupidity of everyone who did anything marginally important. I am your host, Azalea. I also go by Wyatt. I am an author, YouTuber, and a guy who really loves screaming into the void. Today we'll be looking at all the times the United States accidentally dropped atomic bombs on itself. It will be very fun and totally not an indictment of humanity. I am joined, as always, by my lovely co-host, the research genius who keeps this podcast honest, Jay. How we doing?
Doing all right. Doing pretty good, actually. Had a rather bad start to the week, just feeling sick, but that's mostly gone by now.
Yeah, you sure you're all right?
Yeah, more or less.
How's work?
Work's going well. Yeah. I actually was able to take the first 2 days of this week off, so that was good.
And taking days off, what's that like?
You don't get to? I mean,
legally I do. Like, I have vacation days stored up, but, like, I don't know if I'll ever, like, because I'm responsible for scheduling the people who would be on shift when I'm not.
Yeah.
So, like...
Yeah, for listeners who, obviously wouldn't know this, Wyatt actually is a manager in a customer service position.
We won't tell you what customer service position, so if you're ever, like, getting your tires changed or at a pizza restaurant or something, just know, I could be behind the entire operation. So live in fear. Jay is, of course, a research assistant working for some very powerful people that we shouldn't talk about, and we're moving on now. Yeah, again, this is No One Is Competent, a podcast that is meant to be fun. It's meant to be educational. What is this podcast supposed to do, Jay? I've kind of realized the other day that I don't know if we ever, like, talk to each other about that.
We can figure that out later.
Fair enough. This is only episode 3. This is the last episode we're going to be recording before launch, so that's fun. We've been doing this for like 11 weeks, and we still have no idea if anyone likes it. Anyway, speaking of liking it, before we get into things, I'd like to remind y'all that one thing you could totally do to really help us out is to leave a review on whatever podcasting app medium thing that you're on. So if you're on Apple, leave us a review. If you're on Spotify, I don't know if they let you review there, but hack into Spotify and change their code to let you do reviews and leave us a review. If you're on YouTube, leave some comments, subscribe, and also tell your friends, tell your family, tell your random neighbors. When you're in a traffic jam, lean out your window and just scream, "Listen to No One Is Competent" at people. I would deeply appreciate that. If you want to interact with us, we now officially have an email, nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. You can email us some listener feedback, any questions you have for us, which we might read off at the end of episodes. We also would accept those comments and questions in our YouTube comment section. And also, feel free to share stories of incompetence that you see or experience in your own life there. We can ensure anonymity. Jay, is that all the plugs? Plugs. We've got Jay, you do the plugs. I've talked for too long.
Oh, you can find me on Twitter primarily at Jaharis48, and that's really where I'm most active. So if you ever want to reach out to me, it's probably a good way to do it. alongside the email, of course. How about you, Wyatt?
I am on Twitter at Wyatt Azalea, and I am on YouTube at Wyatt the Word Weaver. Hopefully, by the time this podcast is out, both of my August videos have been published. One on a very weird Mega Man spinoff about terrorism, and the other one about the Kill La Kill character Satsuki Kirin. I'm very excited about both of those videos. They're going to be very good as soon as I can get them finished.
And do make sure to subscribe to Wyatt on YouTube so I don't overtake him in subscription count over there.
Yes, if Jay overtakes me in sub count, which he didn't even plug his YouTube because Jay doesn't want you to know about all the times he spends simping for VTubers, I will do self-harm. Anyway, moving on to a much more cheery subject. All of the times that humanity almost came to the edge of extinction because of complete stupidity and incompetence. What are we talking about exactly, Jay?
Well, today we'll be talking about accidents involving everybody's favorite object, nuclear warheads.
Yes, so this is very clear from the jump. We are not talking about nuclear power. So no Chernobyl, no 3 Mile Island. Those are different episodes, a different subject. Today we are almost entirely talking about making the bombs.
Indeed.
The bomb diggities, the bomb diggity doodah. Alright, let's get into it already. So, 3 episodes into No One Is Competent, it's time for this show to quit pretending and embrace its true destiny, which is to become a low-rent ripoff of Well, There's Your Problem, because we first need to talk about what is nuclear bomb. So, I'm about to give y'all a crash course on how nuclear physics and chemistry works. Am I qualified to do this? Not really. This basically means I am less scientifically literate than anyone who's really qualified to talk about science, but, very much importantly, I am more scientifically literate than almost anyone else who is entertaining to listen to on any podcast platform that you'll run into, save maybe Hank Green. So, if someone does know more than me, they're probably not funnier than me. And if someone's funnier than me, they probably don't know more than me. So yeah, that's your warning from the jump. None of this stuff is gonna go beyond a 10th grade level. This is gonna be easy. You're smart enough to figure this out. Everyone listening to this podcast is incredibly smart and incredibly attractive. And I would have sex with all of you. Hey y'all, this is Editing Bay Azalea from the future. Just wanted to clarify that all the science in this episode has been checked over by a man who was taught chemistry at a college level after he spent 20 years at the Savannah River site working in tritium refinement and disproving cold fusion. So there's some expertise behind this one. I have simplified some of it to be a little easier to understand, so both the eggheads and the mouth breakers and money are going to be fine. Just wanted to get that clarification in there and back to your regularly scheduled program. Where do we begin? Well, we begin in the 19th century, the 1800s. This is where chemistry, really explodes as a real thing. All right, scientists are using weights and measures and calculations to determine basically, the nature of reality. This is where the vast majority of the periodic table gets identified, separated from each other. We're like, this is this chemical and element, this is this chemical and element, and these are their natures. This is how much they weigh, this is what they do, this is what they look like, smell like. And we also start to identify and learn how to produce electrical and magnetic fields, okay? A lot of people start poking around with rocks, figuring out what they do. And some people notice that some of those rocks that lay on the end of the periodic table, the heavy ones, they seem to be emitting some sort of ray. So we have Wilhelm Röntgen and Henry Becquerel figure out that uranium salts are giving off a mysterious power. They would eventually name this X-rays, okay? And then you have Marie and Pierre Curie right after the turn of the century, founding the field of radiology. We're not going to get into Marie Curie. She's far too competent to be a subject of this podcast. She was an utter badass. her and her husband, they discovered radium and polonium together. They also strapped radium salts to each other's arms to measure the burns. Pierre would die, I think, in a car crash, but Marie would live long enough for that radium salt exposure to turn out to not be a good idea. Pro tip, if you want to work in the early field of nuclear research, get into a mechanical accident in your 30s. That is the 100% best way to go. So Marie Curie, she invents the X-ray, and she finds out a bunch of practical uses for these rays. But what are these rays? Well, we know these rays are radiation. Why does the rock give off the radiation? Well, it has to do with the nucleus of the atom. Now, you know atoms, all right? Jay, you know what an atom is.
More or less, yeah.
Yeah, you learned about this in, like, 5th grade, 8th grade, and then 10th grade, again, because we teach chemistry in the worst way possible, by repeating stuff and relearning crap over and over. What are the 3 parts of the atom?
Protons, neutrons, and electrons.
Yes. Now, for 99% of chemistry, and by the way, we're going to be doing this mostly from a chemist perspective, because chemistry is the fun science, and also I'm in charge. Anyway, for 99.99% of chemistry, electrons are really the movers and shakers of the science. Most of chemistry is just electrons going from one place to another. They're how electricity works. Everything that goes boom, that reacts, the breath that's powering your lungs and body, is all electrons moving around. However, at the center of an atom is a thing called a nucleus that is made up of protons and neutrons. And we use the amount of these protons to identify the atom, whether it's oxygen, nitrogen, boron, iron, etc. But protons, proton, they're all positively charged. We know positives don't like hanging out with other positives. So for protons to want to stick together all in the same nucleus, they need essentially glue, sort of boring material to sort of stick in between the protons so they don't, again, explode. These are called neutrons. They are neutral. It's very creative. A nucleus is made of a combination of protons and neutrons. Now, very importantly, nuclei are like people. Some of them are very stable. They have very boring office jobs, like Jay, where they go into work and they do their stuff, and they're very upstanding members of society that make sure we all don't die. And then some nuclei are completely unstable, and even if you leave them alone in a dark room, violently explode and spill off tons of nasty electronic rays and hurl things at other people, like other people.
As you do.
Anyway, so certain atoms fall apart, and this is called radiation. When they fall apart, they are breaking apart. And what's interesting is they're often like not breaking apart into like equal pieces. Like, it's not like an atom falls apart and now it's like just in 2 halves. Usually you'll have like essentially nuclear shrapnel get released. This is in the form of alpha radiation, like a spare neutron, or in form of beta radiation, or in the very, very nasty gamma radiation, which is pure energy that is released when those bonds that hold together an atom break apart. We'll talk about that in a sec. So, lots of different nuclei are unstable. You've probably heard of carbon-14. Carbon-14 will always break apart. This is how carbon dating works. That's a different lecture. But the unstable nuclei that early scientists really start to target on is called uranium-235, which falls apart really, really fast and releases a lot of neutrons. Now, this is that nuclear shrapnel I was talking about. Now, this can create a chain reaction. You've heard the term chain reaction here. Basically, in a chain reaction, when 235 falls apart and it releases a neutron, that nuclear shrapnel, right? That neutron essentially becomes a bullet. it becomes a wrecking ball. And it goes and it can hit another atom of uranium-235, or technically anything, but let's just think about 235 right now. This will cause that atom to fall apart maybe earlier than it normally would. And it releases more neutrons, which hit more atoms, and boom, it's a chain reaction, okay? Now later, scientists would be able to synthesize a atom called plutonium-239 that is also very, very good at doing this. Any questions?
Nope. Sounds good to me.
All right. Fission nuclear bomb. All right, what is fission? Well, fission is what I was just talking about. Fission is an atom breaking apart into neutrons and smaller atoms. Think of a fissure in the earth. Fission. It splits apart, okay? Nuclear fission is first, induced in a lab by Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann in 1938. I don't know if I'm pronouncing those names properly. Frankly, I don't care because they're German. A very fun fact here is, German 1938. Otto Hahn was totally down to work on the Nazi nuclear bomb program, but Fritz Strassmann completely refused and, in fact, hid a Jewish woman in his house. Which I guess kind of goes to show you that, one, everybody made their own decisions under the Nazis, and two, being a scientist has absolutely nothing to do with what is in your soul. Fission is figured out, it was known as a thing that could happen all throughout the 20s and 30s, and it is achieved in 38. Now, for those of you who don't know your history out there, when's the first time we set off a bomb?
45.
So, that's a 7-year gap. So why is it so hard to go from, being technically able to do it to being able to practically do it? That's because fission is hard, and what's even harder is going supercritical. Alright. Now, remember what I talked about a chain reaction earlier? Well, that's essentially what supercritical means, is a chain reaction. But supercritical is a better term because it kind of, helps visualize what's actually going on. So, imagine, if you will, a group with one super crazy whack job person and 10 calm people are sitting at a table. If that one guy starts going nuts and throwing stuff and having a mental health crisis, those 10 calm people can kind of calm him down and be like, yo, it's cool, we're calling some folks, let's go talk, everything's fine, right? Sure. But if that super crazy person or unstable individual happens to be around another unstable individual, or a person who's usually stable but maybe is having just a bad day, someone says something angry, they respond in rage, suddenly you have another angry person, right? So let's say, hypothetically, you were really malevolent and you wanted to cause as much society destabilization as possible. Well, what you would do is you would put as many mentally unstable, crazy, angry people around each other as possible. And you would try to get the calm and reasonable people out of the way so they wouldn't have the chance to calm them down. This is called supercriticality. In order to make a bomb, you need a density of stuff that can go boom, all right? You need to create more neutrons than you absorb. You need more uranium-235, and you need less of uranium-238. Problem is, uranium-238 is 99, etc. of the uranium. Okay?
Yeah.
So, if you've just got uranium-238, too bad. You got nothing. You need as pure a uranium-235 as possible. So when one neutron hits another atom, instead of that neutron getting harmlessly absorbed, that atom will split off and spit off more neutrons, okay?
Yeah.
For early scientists, making a bomb, making a nuclear bomb, is actually really, really easy from an engineering standpoint. Not that hard. Getting the amount of uranium required to make the bomb and then refining that uranium, that is much, much more difficult. And this would be pertinent because resources were about to be quite strained because a little thing called World War II was breaking up at this time, which we should probably talk about, and I'll knock it over to the history guy. Jay, let's take over. Tell me about the Manhattan Project.
So, as you mentioned, the nuclear fission had been discovered in Germany in 1938 by Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann. Now, this made a few people worried because, Germany was led by a certain man named Adolf Hitler at the time, and Hitler had a lot of people who disliked him for very good reasons and who feared him. Now, amongst those people included the Hungarian physicists Eugene Wigner and Leo Szilard, and they got together to write a letter to President Roosevelt, this being Franklin Delano Roosevelt, warning him of the danger of fission bombs and encouraging him to authorize the start of a nuclear weapons program in the United States. Albert Einstein even signed this letter.
Yeah, I had actually, in school, I don't know about you, Jay, but I'd always learned that Albert Einstein wrote the letter. Two other guys wrote the letter, and they got Einstein to sign it so Roosevelt would pay attention for clout.
I think Edward Teller was
again,
also
it's very
involved.
important to note that there's tons of smart people all around Europe, all around America, Japan, other nations that know theoretically how a nuclear bomb could be made or that it's possible.
Sure, yeah.
Can do the back of the napkin math and are looking at the back of the napkin math and how many people that could kill and going, oh no. But again, actually making the bomb is going to require a lot of the resources of several governments. The Nazis were trying to make a bomb, the Japanese, the Russians, they were all trying to do it, but the Manhattan Project got there first.
Indeed. As you mentioned, it did require a ton of resources, and in 1939, America wasn't actually at war. And because of that, the Manhattan Project itself didn't actually begin until 1942, obviously after Pearl Harbor, a few months afterwards, actually. But when it began, it kicked into high gear pretty quickly. The project involved scientists from America, ones from Europe who had fled the Nazis, and eventually also incorporated in the British Tube Alloys program, which was Britain's nuclear weapons project. And while you had all these brilliant physicists, nobody really knew exactly what design would work, because nobody had ever done this before.
But this is the real strength of the Manhattan Project, right? Because we have so many different scientists from so many different countries coming together, this allowed them to test tons of different hypotheses and work in different labs all across the United States on different projects that might work, might not work, but one of them is gonna work.
Indeed. And at the end of the day, they actually came up with two different designs for a nuclear bomb, both of which worked.
Yes, and I guess, so we're still on a fission bomb, and I need to explain, so most people know, two nuclear bombs have been dropped in war, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those were two different types of bombs, okay? First bomb on Hiroshima, this is Little Boy, all right? This is a bomb with uranium in it, and it uses what we call the gun barrel method, all right? So what's interesting about a nuclear bomb is all bombs, the gun barrel method is the simplest, most just straightforward, redneck, non-complicated way you can do this. Even that's pretty complicated. Nuclear bombs are actually several bombs inside of a bomb, as I will explain in a bit. Because, again, you need to achieve supercriticality. So you have what's called the fissile material, your payload, your uranium-235. You need to get that uranium-235 to go supercritical. And what you need to do is you need to make it go supercritical as quickly as possible, and preferably you want it to all go supercritical all at once. Again, this is called critical density, all right?
Yes.
You want it as dense as possible, and you want it to all go off at once. The more of it you can have go off at once, and the faster it goes off all at once, equals bigger boom. So essentially, imagine a tube with the gun barrel method. The uranium is kind of on either side, and on either side of the uranium, on like the far ends, there is like conventional explosives. So the conventional explosives explode. They essentially, imagine two bullets shooting at each other. They shoot the uranium at each other. They hit at high speeds. Boom, supercriticality. Fat Man, the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. I should note. So the reason they're called Little Boy and Fat Man. So Little Boy was much more cylindrical because it's using that gun barrel method, right? Whereas Fat Man had a much more elegant and, in my opinion, cool as fuck design, all right? So essentially, it was a lot fatter, it was a lot bigger because it was a sphere, okay? What they essentially did is they had plutonium in the middle, okay, as like the inner layer of the sphere. And then they had like just a shell of TNT around the plutonium. So they detonated the TNT, which essentially the blast went off, again, it's a sphere, so it goes off at all sides simultaneously. That smushes the plutonium together, achieves criticality.
Now, stepping back a bit, the first actual test of a nuclear bomb was the Trinity test. I'm sure that a lot of you might be familiar with photos from this test. They're pretty well known. And this test occurred in July of 1945. And that was really, the first actual evidence that these bombs could work.
Yeah, everybody knows Oppenheimer gets up there, goes all chuny, quotes the Bhagavad Gita, which everybody loves to talk about because everybody loves an edgelord.
Indeed. Now, of course, by July of 45, Germany had already surrendered, so the European front of World War II was over. However, the war in the Pacific was still raging on, and faced with the prospect of a highly costly invasion of Japan, which would have almost certainly resulted in huge amounts of casualties, the US decided to use atom bombs on Japanese cities.
And there is a lot of controversy about this use that we are going to get into none of, because that is not the purpose of this podcast. You can hear thousands of hours of right-wingers and leftists and everyone arguing about this crap.
There's a new book or journal article about this debate like every single year. And perhaps rightly so, but yeah, we don't have the time to deal with that. So the first bomb, of course, was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th, and the second on Nagasaki on August 9th. After this...
That is not long after Trinity. Like, they turned that around fast.
Yep. Yeah, less than a month.
And that kind of goes to show that this is the No One is Competent podcast, but the Manhattan Project is legitimately one of, like, the most miraculous feats of science and engineering ever pulled off by the human race. Hundreds of millions of dollars moved to make up not only several different types of bombs that worked. Plutonium gets isolated and essentially invented while doing this as a synthetic element. No, plutonium does get synthesized, quote, in the wild during star formation and star explosion, but it does not stick around for very long, which is why it has all of the properties of it that we heavily enjoy.
And you can't exactly go over to a forming star to collect some.
No, you can't.
Now, while in hindsight 2 bombs were enough to force Japan's surrender, the military at that time didn't know that would be the case, and they had prepared a 4th bomb, which likely would have been dropped over Tokyo. This bomb was similar in design to Fat Man, what was used in Nagasaki, and thus involved a core of plutonium. A core which would later go on to gain the rather ominous nickname, the Demon Core.
Da-da-da! Da-da-da-da! Seriously, Jay, have you ever heard anything that sounds more like an episode of OG Star Trek than the Demon Core?
Doesn't come to mind. Maybe just various titles from Shakespeare, and that's about it.
And we've got on the YouTube a picture of this thing up there. Just to picture that, this is 14 pounds of plutonium.
Yes.
In a perfect sphere. All right? It's terrifying. And
Indeed.
It's not going to be put in a bomb. So that just leaves people to, mess with it.
Yeah, what could go wrong?
I don't know, Jay. What could go wrong? I wonder what you're about to tell me about.
Well, on August 21st, 45, so less than a month after Fat Man was detonated over Nagasaki, a physicist by the name of Harry Daghlian was conducting a criticality test on the Demon Core in Los Alamos Laboratory. This test was to observe the plutonium core as it approached a state of criticality and then supercriticality by manually placing bricks of tungsten carbide around the core. The idea being...
Yeah, the way this would work is the tungsten carbide... Imagine, like, you're essentially creating, like, a brick oven. The tungsten carbide reflected the radiation from the plutonium and sent it right back at it. And this would make it hot, which would make it go supercritical. And they were kind of, like, seeing how many of these bricks we could put around it and what readings you would get and how fast. It's more complicated than that, but you guys understand. They're making a really complicated brick oven.
Yes. And because of just the nature of this test... Pushing it to supercriticality would not cause a nuclear detonation like what happened over Nagasaki, but it would still be very not good, as Harry Daghlian would discover when he accidentally dropped one of the bricks onto the core itself, briefly observing a blue flash of light. Daghlian reacted very quickly, removing the brick by hand, but in doing so was exposed to a fatal dose of radiation.
Yeah, it's kind of a case of ah, crap, let me fix that. Oh,
yeah. And rather unfortunate for him, he would die roughly 25 days afterwards.
We're not going to get into the nature of dying from radiation poisoning, but I'll put it like this. There are no good ways to go. There are many bad ways to go, and that is one of the worst ways.
Indeed it is.
So, the Demon Core, it's already killed one guy. Later, I think a security guard that was in the room at the time would die, like, in his 50s or 60s from cancer, obviously caused by this exposure. It's very important to remember that, like, at this point, this technology is still very new. And while, like, all these guys are super smart, and they know on paper how bad this stuff can be, but, like, it hasn't fully gotten through their heads how dangerous nuclear material is. Well, okay, to be clear, it's gotten through a lot of their heads, like Enrico Fermi. Totally understood how dangerous this stuff was. But one thing we're gonna get into a lot in this podcast is one of my fundamental beliefs, that is, people think of intelligence the wrong way. People are like, oh, there's smart people, there's dumb people, and there's people who are kind of in the middle. IQ. Nah, that's bullshit. Intelligence and stupidity, smart and dumb, these are two completely separate stats that are fully unbound levels on the character creator, alright? You can have a very high intelligence and still also have a very high stupidity, as we will get into in the Ballad of Louis Slotin.
The year after Harry Daghlian's unfortunate accident, one of his close friends, Louis Slotin, was conducting another criticality test using, again, the Demon Core, which is not known as the Demon Core at the time, but would be shortly afterwards. Now, Slotin's test involved placing the core into a half sphere of beryllium. If this is hard to envision, we'll have a picture on the YouTube video. Essentially, you have the sphere core sitting inside of a hemisphere of beryllium, and another half sphere would be lowered on top of it. And beryllium, like tungsten carbide, is a neutron reflector. Now, it was very important that these two half spheres not touch and fully enclose the plutonium.
Because if it would, you'd go supercritical.
Yes. In order to prevent this, the test was designed to have shims in between the two halves, so they physically could not touch each other. However, Louis Slotin, who had a reputation for having a certain degree of bravado and recklessness, preferred to conduct the test in a manner which was faster and a little bit more hands-on. He did away with the shims and instead used the face of a flathead screwdriver to raise and lower the top cover by hand.
What could go wrong? Is like, I'm sure everyone else there was like, this is great.
Not exactly. Enrico Fermi, as you mentioned earlier, warned Slotin that he would be dead within a year.
Fermi, by the way, often referred to as the father of nuclear physics and chemistry, probably one of the top 100, if not top 50, top 20 smartest people to ever exist.
And other scientists, based on a remark by Richard Feynman, referred to the experiment as tickling the dragon's tail.
Yeah, fair point. If you're doing something and Richard Feynman's like, oh, that's a little spicy there, buddy, you might be really dumb.
Yeah. On the fateful day in May, while demonstrating the experiment, another physicist, actually the man who was going to be replacing Slotin in his role at Los Alamos, the screwdriver slipped and Slotin's luck ran out. The two cores came into contact, exposing Slotin to a lethal dose of radiation.
So for the rednecks listening, I know what y'all are thinking, and yes, this is a situation of, alright, y'all watch this.
It's reported...
He's just got a screwdriver around 14 pounds of plutonium, and he's just like, it'd be fine. And like, listen, this is kind of the through line of this episode. Human beings are awful at threat assessment.
Yes.
Okay, some human beings are awful at threat assessment. Jay, would you like to give an example of this?
Well, I think you were telling me the other day that you're still driving around in a car whose airbags may or may not be functional.
I mean, they may be functional. I mean, just a year and a half ago, Toyota sends me a letter that ignoring your urgent airbag and seatbelt recall could result in injury. Our records indicate that this recall has not been completed on your 2006 Scion XA. And I get this letter in the mail about a year ago, and it's just like, well, it's like, even if it's free of charge, like, it takes like an hour, 3 hours to change the airbags, and like, I also have to deal with the social anxiety of going into a mechanic. No, I mean, it's been at like the bottom of my list for like 15 months now. I might get to it in September. There's a chance I get to it in September.
Please do.
I mean, what's the worst that could happen?
Well, I mean, you won't be exposed to lethal radiation most likely, but getting into a crash without airbags or working seatbelt tensioners is not exactly ideal.
Yeah, but what if I don't get in a crash?
Anyways. So Louis Slotin is briefly exposed to a lethal dose of radiation. It's described, again, as seeing a bright blue flash of light and experiencing a sour taste in the mouth. And while he's able to flick the beryllium cover off of the demon core almost instantly, he knew that he was done for. It's even reported that the first words he said after this took place was simply, "Well, that does it." And that indeed did do it for him, and rather unfortunately, he would be dead within 9 days.
All right, so we made the bombs, we won World War II, and that's it for all for all of the bombs. We don't need no nuclear bombs no more.
You would think so, except the end of World War II simply foreshadowed a new conflict, one which wouldn't involve outright warfare, but at least not between the two major powers, but would entail a great degree of competition. This, of course, being the Cold War between the United States and her allies and the Soviet Union.
So, Jake, could you explain how the Soviets make their bombs?
Well, the Soviets had actually quite thoroughly infiltrated the Manhattan Project with their spies, meaning that they had a good degree of knowledge on the nuclear bomb even before, Hiroshima.
Didn't they, like, infiltrate through the British?
Yes. Yeah, there's certain members of the British program
MI6, my ass.
were the Soviet informants. And it's even reported that Stalin knew of the bomb before Harry Truman did. But that being said, the Soviets would have been able to create their own eventually, almost certainly. They had the resources, and especially once they knew that it was possible, obviously once the US showed it was possible, they would have made a nuclear bomb anyways.
Yeah, there's plenty of people in the Soviet Union smart enough to pull it off. Just stealing the research just probably accelerated them by 3 to 5 years, something like that.
Yeah. Now, the first few years after World War II, the US actually enjoyed a monopoly over nuclear weapons, which obviously is a rather nice thing to have for a great power. This came to end in 1949 when the Soviets tested their first atom bomb, and that really began the nuclear arms race.
Yeah, so now you have the Soviets and the Americans, and also the French, but no one cares about the French, making their own bombs, testing them out, and they're trying to make more and more powerful bombs. Now, we've been talking about fission bombs so far, but now it's time to go even further beyond, because we're going to talk about a thing you've probably heard of, hydrogen bombs, H-bombs, or what they're actually called, fusion nuclear bombs. Okay, so now the chemistry is back. Jay, are you excited that the chemistry is back?
Let's just say that I'm glad that you're handling this part of the episode.
This is not like this isn't even college level. All right, whatever.
It's fine. It's just that, between the two of us, I think I know a little bit more history, and you know a fair bit more chemistry.
Physics is weird. Specifically, the physics of super, super small stuff. Quantum mechanics. This is something that Einstein really pioneered, but essentially, once you get small enough, smaller than cells, smaller than microscopes can really say, physics kind of inverts. And things stop behaving the way that Newton and Copernicus and all of the classical physicists made the laws about how they would act. All right?
Yeah.
Now, you would assume logically that, like, breaking something apart, like, would produce energy. That's how, for instance, combustion works.
Sure.
And that putting something together, like, consumes energy.
Makes sense.
This is not true in the nuclear world. Putting something together actually creates energy just like taking something apart. Remember, taking something apart is called fission. Putting it together is called fusion, which is a little easier to remember because you're just fusing them together. Now, fusion creates an amount of more energy than fission on a completely different scale. Fission reactions are more or less the most powerful energy generator that human beings are capable of observing in the universe. As an example, you at home know a lot about fusion reactions, and you witness fusion reactions every day. It's called the sun. The sun is a giant nuclear bomb in the sky that is using fusion detonations to produce the energy that powers the entire planet, grows the plants, powers the weather, creates heat differentials, everything. Basically, if you take two hydrogen atoms, which remember is the smallest one, and you stick them together to make helium, you create a fuck ton of energy. Way more energy than fusion. What's also important to note about this is, remember, fission reactions are made with plutonium-239 and uranium-235. You can also use other stuff, but at the time, this is what they're using.
Yeah.
And remember, those are really hard to get your hands on to make the plutonium, to refine the uranium. For fusion reactions, you just need hydrogen, which is in water, which is everywhere. Specifically, you need deuterium and tritium, which are isotopes of hydrogen with neutrons attached to it, but don't worry about that. Fusion nuclear bombs involve fusion reactions. Now, what's very important to note is that the whole boom does not really come from the fusion.
remember how I said that the bigger a boom you get in a fission bomb depends on how fast all of the material goes supercritical at once?
Yeah.
Well, in order to do that, you need to produce as much heat as possible. Jay, what produces the most heat in the universe?
Well, fusion.
Yeah, so you set off a fusion reaction. So basically, the way a fusion nuclear bomb works on I'm stripping it down to the least complicated way, is you essentially have 3 stages. Okay, you have a conventional explosive, like just think of TNT, C4, plastic, anything that goes boom. You blow that up. That sets off a fusion reaction where deuterium and tritium particles, which again are just fancy forms of hydrogen, smash into each other and they fuse. This fusion creates more heat than you can possibly imagine, and that heat sets off a fuck ton of that uranium or that plutonium, that fissile material, all right? And it gets it to blow up. It even makes the stuff that is less likely to blow up more likely to blow up because it's just so much heat at once that it just sets the thing off and they go supercritical. You know, they say fuck it, they blow up all at once. And this creates an insane amount of bang. The downside to this method is that while like just pure fission nuclear bombs are like relatively stable, like uranium and plutonium have half-lives. They're incredibly volatile, but they still have half-lives measured in several thousand years. Tritium is pretty unstable.
Yeah.
And so tritium is hydrogen with 2 neutrons attached to it. Tritium is really hard to make for the vast majority of the Cold War, even maybe into today. There was really only one place in the non-communist controlled world to get tritium. That is in the Savannah River site in South Carolina, which is a facility dedicated to creating nuclear mutated alligators, and as a byproduct, refine a fuck ton of tritium. And put it into nuclear bombs. You gotta do this once every, 6 or 7 years or so. And what's really interesting is that once they, devise this process of plastic explosive sets off a fusion reaction, which sets off a fission reaction in, the 60s, the design of nuclear bombs are, on the largest scope, kind of unchanged since then. Improvements have been made to the delivery system, how you get those bombs around to go. They're more safe, they're more reliable, but it's more or less the same technology. And it's really weird, the entire balance of power in our modern world is held together by a technology that is only slightly younger than my dad. Alright, so we've got the Soviets, we've got the Americans, we've got the French, and they have all these nuclear bombs that can blow up, and they want to know how big they blow up. So what do you do with your new toys? Well, you take it out of the garage, you take it for a test drive, you detonate them.
Yeah. Worth noting that you also have the British at this point in time, though we're not really going to be talking about them today, because it's the British.
Yeah, who cares? So, where are the Soviets and the U.S. and the French dropping all these things?
Well, throughout the entire Cold War, the U.S. conducts over 1,000 nuclear weapons tests. But in the 50s, we're really talking about Nevada.
It feels like about 982 too many.
Yeah. But during the 50s, we're mainly talking about Nevada, where they conduct over 100 atmospheric tests, and the Marshall Islands, Bikini and Anahuac Atoll, which feature over 60 tests. The French are doing it mostly in Algeria, which at this point is still a part of France. Again, big desert environment like Nevada. And the Soviets are mainly conducting their tests out in the Central Soviet Union and the vast expanses of Central Asia.
Yeah, in Nevada, the craters left from these tests are big. Like, you can see them from Google Earth big relatively easily. and obviously this creates just a fuck ton of nuclear pollution, right?
Sure.
The Bikini Atoll
Yeah.
totally displaces native folks, and then when they come back, a lot of them just get poisoned. It's bad. Like, the Russians dropped so many bombs in Kazakhstan, including the largest bomb ever detonated, Tsar Bomba, that it produces tens of millions of cubic meters of toxic waste. We're not going to go into all of the Russian peasants and small villages that just got completely riddled with cancer because of this. But one fun fact I always like to bring up about this is that a lot of this toxic waste got dumped in Lake Karachay or something like that in the I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm not Russian. In the Ural Mountains, which was said to be the most polluted place on Earth before it was infilled with concrete. Jay, you want to guess what year it was infilled with concrete?
Well, this occurred a long time ago, so they must have done that, at least by the 70s, maybe.
2015.
Oh. Well, better late than never.
Yeah, so you said that the French were testing their stuff in Algeria.
Yes, they were. And by the 1960s, the French, as well as a lot of other nations, had largely moved to underground nuclear testing. They had realized by that point just exploding stuff in the atmosphere spread a lot of radioactive material. But
Maybe not a good idea.
But if you dug a really deep shaft and detonated things underground, you could contain a lot of the fallout. But you have to do it properly, and in 1962, they kind of didn't. In what would become known as the Barrel Incident, the French were testing one of their nukes in Algeria, but the shaft leading to it had not been properly sealed, and once it was detonated, radioactive material was released into the atmosphere, exposing hundreds of observers from the French army and government, including their ministers of defense and scientific research at the time, would die 22 years later of leukemia, and an unknown amount of Algerians were likely exposed to radiation as well.
I mean, at least for once the important people also die.
Yeah, a little bit of karma, I suppose. That.
Yeah. What's important to note is that, like, these things were all invented by brilliant nuclear physicists and chemists, and now the people in charge of them are a bunch of non-scientifically literate generals and politicians.
And in places like Algeria or the Marshall Islands, they're detonating these things off essentially in colonized land. So, fun.
Yeah. Nuclear waste and colonization.
Well, name a more iconic duo.
This is not math. Two negatives do not make a positive. All right. I'm tired of dicking around with just like irradiation, and I want incompetence, damn it. The Soviets, they gotta fuck this shit up bad.
Oh yeah, well, we've already talked about, just dumping radiation into lakes and rivers, and they did a fair share of that. Everybody, of course, is familiar with Chernobyl as well, but when we're talking about military disasters, it's really the various mishaps that plagued the Soviet Navy, primarily their submarine fleet, that really set the standard for Soviet nuclear accidents. In 1961, a submarine called K-19 would display this to the fullest. Now, K-19 was the first boat of what NATO refers to as the Hotel class of nuclear ballistic missile submarines. But she would go on to earn the nickname Hiroshima by her crew following a series of mishaps. I think it's not hard to guess that you probably would not want to serve on a nuclear submarine nicknamed Hiroshima.
Not my first choice.
Now, K-19 seems to have been perhaps a bit cursed from the beginning. Her first bad omen occurred upon christening, when a man instead of a woman was chosen to smash the champagne bottle across her hull, and the bottle failed to break. Now, as you...
And that's why men aren't allowed to do important jobs. Ship's cursed. Scuttle the whole thing, send it to India, let them break it. It's over. Don't get in that thing.
Yeah.
It's cursed.
As you know, sailors can be a bit superstitious, and the bottle of champagne failing to
Are
break
you
is-
a dead sailor, or am I the alive sailor? We stay alive because we know what works.
Moving on. Her maiden voyage in 61 would prove that the superstition is, at least in this instance, well-founded. As she was underway, her reactor coolant system, this of course being a submarine powered by a nuclear reactor, sprung a leak, causing the reactor to overheat. Now, nuclear control rods were inserted into the reactor, but they failed to stop the temperature from rising, so the captain had to order the engineering team to basically come up with a jury-rigged repair. They did manage to do so by basically cutting open the air vent and just welding piping going to the water supply to it to flood the reactor with water. This got the temperature down, but in the process released radioactive steam into the submarine's ventilation system, irradiating the entire crew. All 7 members of the engineering team would die of radiation poisoning within the month, and 15 more sailors died within the subsequent 2 years.
So, bad ship. They got rid of it, right?
Nope, they fixed it up and put it back into service. These are expensive ships, expensive submarines. You don't just get rid of them because it happens to kill a few dozen crew. K-19's misfortunes would continue. In 69, she was actually involved with the undersea collision with a U.S. submarine, the USS Gatto, and in 72, a fire broke out on board while she was submerged, killing a further 30 sailors. So,
Yeah, and this is obviously... Earlier, that was an incident with the nuclear reactor. I know we weren't going to talk about energy, but it had nuclear missiles on board.
Yes.
So, like, fuck you, it counts.
yeah, that's military. The Soviets, K-19 is really one of several Soviet submarines which experience accidents. Multiple of them will go down to the bottom of the ocean, still carrying nuclear weapons, some of which are recovered, some of which aren't. But, I mean, you could spend all day reading through the list of Soviet submarine accidents. We won't bore you with
There's
that.
a solid argument to be made that submarines have never really ever been safe to be in, which might be a future episode going all the way back to the beginning, but that's, again, another time. And obviously, like, this would continue into, like, the year 2000 with the Kursk.
Yeah.
Which we will not go into. We will not go into, listen to the Well, There's Your Problem episode. Shit was jank. Moving on. We're gonna end this, of course, by talking about United States incompetence, after we stopped intentionally nuking ourselves, and colonized folks. We then went on to unintentionally nuke ourselves. So Jay, you know most of the history here, but so I live in Georgia, which is sometimes obvious by my accent and sometimes obvious by the fact that I'm completely insane. But I, growing up, occasionally heard, like, this legend that, Georgia and South Carolina share a coast. There's a series of barrier islands down there. Really great hiking, great camping, a lot of Spanish moss. Looks like an alien planet. It's awesome. There's actually a lot of wild horses down there. Don't worry about it. But I have heard that there's, like, a nuclear bomb off the coast of South Carolina. How does a nuclear bomb get into the Atlantic Ocean right next to the continental United States?
Well, it happens when you have a B-47 carrying a nuclear bomb, a Mark 14 bomb, operating in the airspace near Tybee Island on a fateful day in February 1958. I say day, but it was really the dead of night when this B-47 collided with the F-86 Sabre that was also out on an exercise.
Fun fact, Jay, you wanna guess where my grandparents are right now?
Tybee Island.
Yep.
Well, maybe they'll get lucky and fish out a nuclear bomb. Thankfully, the F-86 pilot was able to eject and survive, and the crew of the B-47, and really display a very competent airmanship, were able to regain control of their damaged aircraft.
Okay, but alright, back up. How the hell do two planes run into each other? The sky is big. It's like the biggest thing.
Sure, but it's the dead of night. Neither of these airplanes would have had air-to-air radar that can detect other aircraft. It's not common today, and it was not common at the time. And sure, the sky is big, but every now and then, worst-case scenarios happen, and this is an example of that. Now, while the B-47 crew were able to regain control of the aircraft, they knew that trying to land it would potentially be very tricky. And as such, they asked for permission to jettison the bomb into the ocean before landing. This is actually a very common procedure. Even, a lot of naval aircraft, when they're returning to a carrier, if they have their full weapons loadout, they'll dump bombs into the ocean just to reduce the weight. It just makes landing a lot safer. So this isn't really abnormal. Of course, in this instance, they're also thinking about the fact that if they land, but make a harsh landing, they would have a chance of the nuclear weapon essentially being destroyed on the runway, which would not be good. Permission was granted, and they were able to dump the bomb off of Tybee Island. Now, this was a Mark 15 nuclear bomb, a rather big one, roughly equivalent to 3.8 megatons of TNT in its explosive yield.
Worried. I don't even know if 1 megaton of TNT is. Or 1 kilo. How big a blast is that?
So 1 megaton would be equivalent of setting off 1 million tons of TNT. 3.8 megatons, to put it in comparison, is about equivalent to 253 Hiroshimas, referring to that atom bomb.
That's a lot of Hiroshimas.
That is. There seems to be some confusion as to whether the plutonium core, this being a fusion bomb, it had both plutonium and uranium, but whether that plutonium was installed or not, it seems to be conflicting information from different sources. I imagine just due to the secrecy involved, a lot of people in the government probably didn't even know whether it had the plutonium core. But what we do know is it did have the uranium, and it's sitting somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean off of Tybee Island to this day, as they were never able to find it.
Yeah, it's just buried in silt, probably under a lot of sand and... Yeah.
Yeah.
It's there.
When...
So, if any of you, treasure hunters, you want to find something cool, go get it, Chief.
Yeah.
I maybe should go into, why this doesn't go off. Again, the people who made these bombs were smart enough to put a lot of safety devices in them. Again, remember, these things go off because a physical, conventional explosive goes off, and that was probably secured very, very heavily.
Yes. There are multiple safeguards built into all of these weapons.
Yeah, they're probably using, a plastic explosive, which can only be set off of a detonator. Something that most people don't know is, for instance, with C4, you can light that shit on fire, and it will not go off. You have to physically put the detonator in there, and...
I've even heard that soldiers would burn bricks of C4 just for warmth, because, it wouldn't explode, it would just burn like a briquette.
That's gotta be, the first time you do that has gotta be, particularly surreal, right?
Yeah.
Because, you've probably seen this shit go off in training.
Yeah.
So far, we've had redneck scientists, we've had dumbass French, we've had reckless Soviets with bad submarine design, and we've had accidental crashes of planes in the middle of the night. But it's time to get to the piece de resistance of this episode because we get to talk about Operation Chrome Dome. I actually did not know this was a thing. What I've like heard those words before, but Jay, what is a Chrome Dome if it isn't like a way to trick out I don't know, the hood of your truck?
Well, Operation Chrome Dome was actually a U.S. Air Force operation that took place between 1960 and 1968. And really, it was a program of maintaining a continuous presence in the air of B-52s armed with nuclear weapons. This was spurred on by fear of the missile gap. Anybody familiar with Cold War history of the late 50s might have heard this term. The U.S. thought that the Soviet Union, following Sputnik and following Khrushchev's boasting about the Soviet missile program, had a significant advantage in the amount of nuclear-armed missiles. This would later turn out to be false.
Actually not true, right? Like, the Soviets were actually so bad at doing long-range missiles that they once, like, rushed one and blew up one of their top generals.
Yeah,
blew him up so thoroughly that the only thing left of him was his watch and his Hero of the Soviet Union gold medal, which I believe was like fused into the concrete.
Yeah, if there ever was a missile gap, it would have been very short-lived. Probably would have been gone completely by the 1960s, or, well, rather the U.S. would have had a gap in its favor. But that wasn't known at the time. The U.S. was very fearful that the Soviets had an edge in nuclear missiles. And the Air Force proposed to deal with this by, as mentioned, having nuclear-armed bombers in the air constantly. These bombers flew three approaches. You would have ones flying from the mid-Atlantic, so the Carolinas and Virginia, out across the Atlantic Ocean towards Europe, and then turning around and coming back. You'd have bombers based in New England and the Great Lakes flying up towards Greenland and the Arctic before turning around and heading back. And ones operating from Washington and Oregon, which would fly out up towards Alaska and then into the Arctic on that side and come back. And these flights would last 24 hours. And whenever you would have ones coming into land, you'd have more setting off into the air. For 8 years, there were always nuclear B-52s in the air.
So, like, when my mom was born in 1963, there were, like, a dozen B-52s in the air ready to drop a nuke at any time.
Yes. And the idea being is that if the Soviets, with their huge stockpile of nuclear missiles, achieved a first strike on the United States, destroying runways, these B-52s would still be able to go and respond by bombing the Soviet Union.
And, like, being a pilot in the Air Force and the Navy is like... Wait, we had the Air Force at this point, right?
Yes, this was an Air Force program.
Yeah. So, like, we think of that as, like, a really prestigious, sexy job, but, like, on a practical level, you are essentially a long-haul trucker that isn't even supposed to be delivering anything. Or at least you hope you don't deliver anything. Like, you are in a like, can they even, like, get out of their seats to pee? Like, you got a guy with you, right?
Yeah, I mean, you have a pilot and a co-pilot, and then you'd have a navigator, a bomber, and an engineer as well. And there would be a toilet aboard the bomber, so you could get up and go to the bathroom, come back, but it's very cramped. It's not exactly flying first class. I think if any of you have flown, I know I have, transatlantic and economy, it's not exactly a fun experience. And, that's just sitting in a seat doing nothing for 7 hours. It's not having the stress of piloting an airplane.
That has a nuclear bomb in it.
Or multiple nuclear bombs in it.
And, like, who is doing this? like, these nuclear bombs are made by the smartest, most advanced scientists in the world with tons of degrees. They're being commanded by generals and politicians that are, like, in their 40s and 50s with years of experience. Who is driving these planes?
Well, it's often overworked and tired 20-something-year-olds flying airplanes that are being maintained by overworked and tired ground crews.
Wonderful.
Yep.
Surely this is going to go great.
Well, it does for most of them. Only a very small percent of them have any incidents. But when we're talking about 8 years of continuous flight, even a small percentage of error is a pretty big number.
Yeah. Okay.
Now,
All right.
throughout
Back at the envelope. Like 8 years. Okay. So let's get. I'm gonna type in calculator. Okay. There's 365 days in a year times 8 plus 2 because leap years. All right, so we have
they're
3
conducting
times
about 12 flights.
12 flights a day?
Yeah.
Okay, so that gives us a little more than 35,000 flights. If 1% of those goes wrong, that's 350 accidents.
Yeah.
And that means that if like 0.01% of those go wrong, that's still 3 or 4 nuclear accidents.
Oh yeah, yeah. There are more than 3 or 4. In fact, we won't even mention them all because there are multiple accidents throughout this whole program. And going into them would just be going into a list of error incidents. And it's not really what we...
Could you give our audience just like really quick like an idea of what kind of error we're talking about? Just like a mechanical failure or what?
Most of these will be due to mechanical failures. When you're putting so much strain on the airframe, small things will go wrong. You'll have fuel leaks, you'll have electrical fires, you'll have stress leading to things breaking.
But most of these won't put any distress on the bomb.
No, generally not. But a few incidents did lead to near misses involving the nuclear payloads, as rural North Carolina would discover in 1961.
Carolinas, man.
Yeah, there are a strange amount of these incidents involving the Carolinas. Like I said, we can't mention them all, but it seems like the Carolinas have something of a bomb magnet or whatever.
I mean,
but
have you ever been to the Carolinas?
I've not. The closest I've been is, I guess, Virginia.
Yeah, you can't go to the Carolinas and not be like, yeah, we should blow these all up. Mostly for their lack of quality peaches. And also racist names for lakes.
Yeah. Now, in 1961, one of the B-52s that was taking part in Operation Chrome Dome was flying near the town of Goldsboro over North Carolina when the airplane experienced a fuel leak. This fuel leak quickly escalated into a very large leak and was enough that the crew made the decision to bail out. The plane ended up breaking up in midair, which actually happens when a plane loses control. Essentially, just the G-forces of it tumbling will cause it to shatter in the air, and that's what happens.
So, like, you've got strips of, like, metal plating just, like, flying off it, like a wing comes off or something?
Yeah. And it releases its payload of 2 Mark 49 nuclear bombs. The Mark 49 basically being a slightly improved version of the Mark 15, which we talked about.
So now we're upwards of almost 500 Hiroshimas.
No, the Mark 39 is actually the same strength.
Yeah, but there's 2
the
of
Mark
them.
15. Oh, yes, there are 2 of them.
So 500 Hiroshimas headed at Goldsboro, North Carolina.
They both impact the ground and essentially bury themselves into the dirt. The concerning fact is that one of the bombs, as we mentioned, these have several safety mechanisms, but one of those safety mechanisms seemed to have switched from safe to armed in at least one of the bombs upon impact. There's a rather interesting quote I came across from the lieutenant who is in charge of recovering these weapons was, "Until my death, I'll never forget hearing my sergeant say, 'Lieutenant, we found the arm safe switch.' And I said, 'Great.' He said, 'Not great. It's on arm.'" We really don't know.
Yeah, that'll stay with you till you're dead.
Yeah, we really don't know exactly how close it was to nuclear detonation. Different people seem to have come to different conclusions. But the fact that even one of these safeties had armed itself when it shouldn't have is rather concerning.
1 year! 1 year into Operation Chrome Dome this happens! And this goes on for 7 more years!
Oh yeah. Now, Chrome Dome wasn't only over the United States. These flights occurred over several of our allies, meaning that they also got to join in on the fun. In 1966, over Palmares, Spain, 4 B-28 nuclear bombs were dropped following a mid-air collision between a B-52 and the KC-135 tanker that was refueling it. These bombers obviously have to refuel mid-air on these long flights, and if you know any Air Force pilots, they will tell you that mid-air refueling is very much a skill that you have to learn, especially before more sophisticated pilot aids. It's a very risky thing.
I have never flown a plane. I probably will never fly a plane, but I don't know. I may be just a simple country YouTuber, but that sounds like a bad idea.
Yeah. I mean, they've gotten pretty good at it, but accidents do and did happen. Now, these bombs, the B-28, were a part of a new generation of smaller nuclear fusion bombs. Prior to the 60s, these bombs were generally pretty big, and you could really only carry them in large aircraft.
Like big as a person big? Like how big?
As big as around 10,000 pounds in mass. That's what Fat Man weighed, and it's pretty common for bombs from the 50s. The B-28, on the other hand, weighed less than 2,000 pounds and was shorter than 100 inches. So you could carry these. You could either carry them on smaller aircraft, or you could carry several of them on a large bomber, and 4 of them were being carried by this B-52. Each one had a strength of about 73 Hiroshimas.
That's not even a problem compared to last time.
No. 3 of these bombs impacted the land, and with 2 of them, the conventional explosives actually detonated, scattering radioactive material across the Spanish countryside.
So I have to imagine, I haven't looked into this, but I imagine they detonated in kind of a haphazard way, and they just didn't achieve, like the thing burst open or something, and it just didn't achieve supercriticality. Like, remember, you have to detonate all around the material at once.
Oh yeah, and there are additional safeties which make it so that even if the conventional explosive detonates, if these other safeties aren't operating, then it won't achieve supercriticality. But this was a flaw in the design of the B-28 in that the explosives went off. And this resulted in necessitating a cleanup effort by the US and Spanish governments. At the end of the day, over 6,000 barrels of contaminated soil were removed from the site and shipped back to the Savannah River site for disposal.
And by disposal, we mean feeding to the mutant alligators.
As you do. But it's been found that some contaminated material remains to this day, just not at high enough of a level to be worth dealing with.
By the way, if you think I'm joking about the irradiated alligators, just look it up. Is all I'm saying. Jay, have you ever held like a baby alligator?
No, I've held snakes, but never an alligator.
They are incredibly cute, like just adorable.
They look cute. They do look cute. The 4th bomb landed in the Mediterranean, and was managed to be found by the US thanks to fishermen who saw it impact the water, and who then later sued the United States government, claiming that maritime law gave him a right to a percentage of the bomb's value because he's the one who assisted in the salvage, and eventually settled outside of court.
Go off, King. Go off.
Now, prior to 1966, there were already people in the US government who wanted to get rid of Chrome Dome. Specifically, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, saw it as a waste of money. McNamara, if you're familiar with him, he was the archetype of the bean counter. He came from Ford Motor Company to join the government during JFK's administration. And he's always looking for a way to trim the budget. But the Department of Defense had pushed back against it. They still saw Chrome Dome as necessary, and the Air Force in particular was very attached to it. You know, when we're talking about the branches of the armed service, it's important to remember that the US military budget, even at the height of the Cold War, is not infinite. And all the branches are competing with each other.
Don't tell that to the Soviets.
And for the Air Force, you know, nuclear deterrence was seen as like their big thing. But the Navy's pushing into this. The Navy at this time has nuclear missile-equipped submarines, and the Navy's kind of moving into this sphere. So the Air Force doesn't want to give up anything. And they don't want to give up Chrome Dome. What this leads to is 2 years later, another B-52 experiencing a mechanical issue, a cabin fire, whilst flying over Greenland. The crew were able to bail out. The plane and its bombs crashed and essentially smeared itself over the ice of Greenland, spreading radioactive material across a large area of land. It seems that one of the bombs, again, had its conventional explosives detonate. This flaw in the B-28 wouldn't be fixed until afterwards.
Greenland. Freezing temperatures, volatile volcanoes, and now radioactive waste.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this necessitated a massive cleanup effort on the part of the US and Denmark, and was essentially the final nail in the coffin for Chrome Dome. The critics of the program within the government were able to use this as the reason to cancel it.
Yeah, and I want to draw a parallel between Operation Chrome Dome and the Demon Core instance that we talked about around the middle part of this podcast. Because it illustrates how humans do not logically assess risk, alright? The power and the scope of nuclear weapons make it clear how the things... Like, everyone knows that these could end humanity. If the USSR and the US all launch these things, not good for anyone on planet Earth. Alright? And yet, we put these things in the hands of sleep-deprived 20-somethings flying 12 hours a day. Why? Because, like, human beings always assume that they will be ended by the actions of others. That all of the important things in their life will happen because of deliberate action taken either by them or somebody else. Everything's under somebody's control. Alright? Nothing's gone wrong so far. Why would it go wrong now? Things are reliable, patterns exist, and the world is not chaotic. It's all ordered over and over and over. Fear of the Soviet Union led the United States to be a far greater danger to itself than the rival country because of all these accidents that would happen. Because it hasn't happened before, why would it happen again? We've had thousands of flights go right. Surely we can ignore the fact that we've had a bomb partially arm itself on the way down accidentally. And, you know, this would be tightened up, Chrome Dome would be retired, the Cold War would wind down. Today, nuclear weapons are tried. They're mundane. They're kept in old silos run on ancient technology because it hasn't gone wrong yet. So why wouldn't? The Demon Core was fine. So why would it go wrong? Chrome Dome was fine. So why would it go wrong? So said our grandfathers. So say our fathers. So say us. Because no one is competent. And folks, that is going to do it for episode 3. You can check us out on Twitter. We've got an official feed on there for the podcast. You want to be alerted when all these go live. But just know that they will be going live every other Friday. That is, we ain't going to break that. Especially considering we're like, 4 weeks ahead of schedule at this point?
Something like that.
Yeah, it'd be kind of impressive if we fucked it up at this stage. Wait 6 months, then we'll do it when we're rich and famous. That's when we'll do the upfucking. Once again, you can follow me on Twitter at Azalea Wyatt. You can follow Jay at Jaharis48. I have a YouTube channel, Wyatt the Word Weaver. We have an email account that is run by Jay, so y'all be nice, or I will deletion of actionable threat. Jay, what's the email?
The email is simply no one is competent, just no spaces, just as it is, @gmail.com.
And remember, if you're on Apple, you're on Spotify, leave us a review. 5 stars, do 5 stars. You want to give us 5 stars. You want to give us 5 stars. You also want to tell your mom about the podcast. You want to tell your dad about the podcast. You want to tell your babysitter about the podcast. You want to tell the babysitter that you're fucking behind your wife's back about the podcast. Jay, have I adequately plugged us? Have I plugged all the holes? Are we leaking?
Not quite, Wyatt. Seems that you're perhaps not as competent as you think you are. We are also on Twitter at @not_competent.
Yes, that is @not_competent, because not competent was already taken. We will be launching a guerrilla war against those people as soon as I can drum up some recruits. Okay, so I am Azalea, also known as Wyatt. My co-host is Jay. This is an independently produced podcast with no sponsors or controllers or shadow organizations or people behind us that I know of, at least. I don't know what Jay's got going on in his personal life. Our music is composed by the legendary Sam Bryce. We are dropping every other Friday, and we'll see you in the next one. Y'all be good.